Okay, I think we're ready to start. My name is Mike Beats. I'm the Director of Debate here at Harvard-Westlake, and I want to thank everyone here for coming to our first public debate for our team. I think we'll offer a really good opportunity for you guys, for everyone here to see some outstanding debate from Team USA, and hopefully some lively discussion afterwards. It's no surprise that we picked Martin Luther King holiday to hold a debate like this. It's a day of a lot of platitudes, a lot of things that are said regarding civil rights, the civil rights movement, and where we are in America. And debate offers the opportunity for students to go beyond the platitudes, go beyond the sayings that are repeated over and over, and really see and maybe hopefully analyze a little bit about where we are. We brought together a group of judges that I think will offer really invaluable instruction and feedback to our debaters. I'll introduce each one of them. The first judge is Mr. Kenya Barris. He is the creator of the TV show Blackish. We have Ms. Ann Haley Brown, the managing assistant attorney for the city of Los Angeles. Mr. Jeffrey Harrelson is General Counsel and Executive Vice President of Business and Legal Affairs for the Universal Music Group. We have Douglas Morrell, the Vice President of the ACLU of Southern California and partner at the law firm of Harder, Morrell, and Abrams. And Kimberly West Falcon, with the James P. Bradley Chair in Constitutional Law at Loyola Law School. Team USA sponsors the National Speech and Debate Association. The association sponsors all of the travel, everything that it takes to put together Team USA to provide opportunities for debate, not only in our country but around the world. This is done through generous grants from individuals throughout the country who will support the mission of the National Speech and Debate Association and give opportunities for these students and a number of students to debate people from all different cultures, all different countries, something that without the help of the National Speech and Debate Association would not be possible. We brought a representative from the National Speech and Debate Association who will say a few words. This is Sharon Koshi, who's the Director of Development with them.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone, for being here, especially today. For the last 90 years, the National Speech and Debate Association has provided opportunities for young people such as these to use their voices in advocacy of what they believe. And since that time, over 1.5 million people have gone through the program. Many alumni that you're familiar with, like Oprah Winfrey or 4 sitting Supreme Court justices, or many of the people in the U.S. Congress have found their start in this program. And we're so proud to be able to launch and continue to support USA Debate, not just because these students represent the best of the best in the country, but because they come from a wide variety of different geographic and educational backgrounds. And the opportunity that we have as an organization to support their work in showing not only other countries what we do in terms of debate, but also by embodying the values of civic discourse and democracy has been an incredible pleasure to watch, and I'm sure you will enjoy what they do today. In general, the organization supports about 150,000 students each year at 3,500 U.S. high schools. We also do middle school and college debate, and it's been a joy to be part of the organization and see students grow and develop through their talents that have been fostered through speech and debate. So really want to thank you for the opportunity that these young people have to share their message with you, and thank you so much to the judges for being part of this process as well. Mike. Okay, a little bit about the nuts and bolts of how this is going to work.
The folks on this side will debate in a format that's been modified a little bit from the World Schools Debate championship style format. Ms. Cindy Timmons will be explaining a little bit about the debate format. After the debate is done, we'll take a brief intermission and allow the judges to deliberate and make their decision. After the intermission, people come back in, and hopefully there's some discussion after we announce a decision, some discussion between the debaters and the judge that we would invite all of you all to stay and observe and hopefully learn. And then afterwards, we hope you'll stick around for a meet and greet with some drinks and small food in the back after we're finished. So I'd like to introduce Cindy Timmons. She's the manager and the coach for Team USA, and she'll explain a little bit about the format.
It's an honor to be with you here today. If you know anything about the founding of our country, you know that our country's roots are based in debate. We often think we're unique that way, though, that America invented debate, but that's simply not true. Debate exists around the world. And in the past 24 months of the national organization sponsoring the USA debate, the national team of the country, we have debated in multiple countries on multiple continents representing your country and promoting civil discourse. It is appropriate that today, on a day that honors a man, a leader, who used civil discourse to advance the idea of civil rights, that we bring your national team to you today to debate that very idea. It is exciting as a former history teacher to see an audience gather together on an afternoon to watch debate. If you know anything about our political history, debate used to be the entertainment for people around the country. Thousands of people would gather to hear discourse. I would like now to introduce you to a few the members of the team and also tell you a little bit about the format. The format involves two teams debating one motion. The two teams are typically called the government or the proposition, that is these four students, who will be defending the motion, and we will be announcing that motion in a second. And then there are four students on the opposing team called the opposition, who will then be responding to the ideas that the proposition advances. There are 3 constructive speeches on each side. We've modified the format for them to be 6 minutes each. And then there are 2 reply speeches on each side as well. What a wonderful opportunity to remind you that in the interest of civil discourse, if you could please put your phones on silent, that would be appropriate. Let me introduce you to the members of your national debate team. Here we have Milan Armitage from Los Angeles. Liz Yount, who is not only from Los Angeles, she attends Harvard-Westlake. Joshua May, who is so talented, he represents both Colorado and New Mexico. Sonia Wong, who actually is returning as the 2nd place national LD champion in the United States of America, and she is from San Jose. Those are team proposition. Team opposition, we have Julia Lauer from New York City. Nikhila Ramaswamy from Dallas, Texas. And Amit Kukreja from New Jersey. And Nicholas Angelopoulos from Los Angeles. Moderating the debate will be our debater from Houston, Texas, Colette Faulkner. My partner in coaching the USA debate team happens to be my husband, Aaron Timmons. We also have 2 alum from our first USA debate team who happen to be with us here today. Danny DuBois, who now attends Harvard University. And Shania Hunt, who goes to UCLA. Thank you very much. I thank you everyone for a wonderful time. Colette, at this time, if you will announce the motion, and we'll go ahead and begin.
Thank you everybody for coming out today. The motion that we will be debating today is this House believes that the politics of individual identity threaten the future of civil rights movements. And I'll repeat that one more time. This House believes that the politics of individual identity threaten the future of civil rights movements. At this time, I now welcome the first speaker of the proposition side to come up and give their remarks.
Before we begin, the USA debate team would like to thank all of you for being here and giving us the opportunity to debate. In particular, we'd like to thank Mr. Mike Feets and his team, Steve, Shania, Travis, Danny, and Daniel, our esteemed panel of judges, Mr. Cherian Koshi, the NSDA, and of course our wonderful coaches, Mr. Aaron Timmons and Mrs. Cindy Timmons. Without all of your support, today's debate would not be possible. And with that, let's begin. When our brothers and sisters marched together in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, they came together for a common cause despite their differences. Whether they were black or white, male or female, gay or straight, their message was clear. Institutional injustice is unacceptable. Because injustice creates action, but identity politics only divides activists, we are proud to propose today's motion. First, what are identity politics? Identity politics is the coalescing of people into groups based on particular social identities, including but not limited to race, gender, sexual orientation, and political affiliation. In 1909, the NAACP was founded when Black Americans in an oppressed community decided they were going to fundamentally change their societal conditions because this country was never designed to support them. The movement was catalyzed by the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision, and over the decades it expanded to encompass issues of class, gender, and race to bring us where we are today, still fighting for these identities that have been systemically oppressed. The burden of teen government is not to advocate for an abstract world without any conceptions of identity, but rather a world in which identity is not the primary focus during the future of the civil rights movement. Team opposition's burden is to show that a focus on the politics of individual identity is essential to the future civil rights movement. I will be presenting two substantive arguments in this speech. The first, that identity politics fractures coalitions. And this is because people separate themselves based on parts of their identity that are important but not essential. For instance, a straight black man and a queer black man will be separated by the intersection of the queer black identity. The more unifying aspect is the identity of blackness, which is essential, but these two men feel divided by queerness instead of unified by blackness. The result is that most people cannot agree on an agenda or even a fundamental conception of identity because they cannot decide what type of black or what type of female they want to be. Some examples of this are how in second-wave feminism, white feminists systemically excluded black feminists from holding positions of power and movements, and how black police officers cannot become black protesters because the perceived important identity of protester or police officer is elevated over the underlying identity of blackness. This only breeds resentment among intersecting identities because perceived important aspects serve as barriers for uniting over essential intrinsic aspects of identity. This only leads to infinite regression. The more individuals choose to identify themselves in specific categorizations, movements stop from focusing on issues of material change because of so many intersectional approaches that fight within each other. Yes?
Coming together and erasing identity is and always has been code for silencing minorities.
It's not about acknowledging your identity. Team proposition shows that when we make that the sole focus of our movements, instead of uniting around ideas and the injustices, we only create internal tension that fractures our coalitions, preventing future civil rights movements. Now let's move on to our second point, that identity politics commodifies history through selective amnesia. In other words, you pick the parts of your identity that bring you credibility while ignoring the history and the people who suffered for your opportunity to succeed. This separatist individuality is detrimental for collective movements because you begin to think you rose to that position of success on your own. Politicking your identity or commodifying your history is being a representative of the success of your identity, but pretending you were never a part of that struggle. We can see this in the example of Dr. Ben Carson. Dr. Ben Carson attributes his success to hard work alone, yet he ignores the years of Black activists that have given him the opportunity to succeed. Dr. Carson commodifies his history by using it to establish his credibility for political support. And there is such an infinite regression to his identity that he begins to feel that he is the exception to the rule, that he is the, quote, intelligent Black man. Additionally, identity politics separates us from the obligation we have to the collective memory of our identity and history and creates this myth of a self-made individual. Ben Carson doesn't have to acknowledge systemic boundaries that held him back socially, economically, and politically when he campaigns. But this hurts more than just him. It hurts societies and future civil rights movements when powerful institutions like the Republican Party can simply point to him as a token of a post-racial America. A Black man will put on preppy clothes and change his innate dialect to erase certain aspects of his Blackness that white people deem threatening to rise to higher positions in his job. And this is bad for the future of the civil rights movement because this man's pseudo-exceptional version of himself makes him money with the people who used to hate him the most. He rejects his innate Blackness to appease his environment instead of challenging the institution that forces himself to alter himself in the first place. Another example is the hashtag movement, Why I Don't Need Feminism, which is made popular because many women in today's society believe that they are strong and independent and do not need men. However, this ignores that the very reason they can say these things is because of feminists before them who literally died for their right to vote, to feel empowered and speak their own opinion. The impact of this is that it stagnates future civil rights movements and lulls us into a sense of complacency that we live in a post-racial or post-gendered society. If you are from a marginalized identity, someone else paid a serious price for you to get there. And it is because that the identity politics fractures coalitions and leads to selective amnesia that we are proud to propose today's motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia, for your remarks. We now invite the first speaker of the opposition side to deliver her speech.
When our brothers and sisters marched together in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, they united for a common cause despite their differences. Whether they were Black or white, male or female, gay or straight, their message was clear. But Sonia, that's where the message ends. It didn't matter how infinitely regressive their identity was. They saw institutional injustice based on a common identity, bonded together, and fought against it. Because we believe politics dictates what you are, but identity politics dictate who you are. We are so proud to oppose this motion. I'm going to be doing a couple things in the course of today's debate. First is I'm going to establish the framework debate between both the proposition and the opposition. Then I'm going to go through and refute their first two substantive arguments, and then I'll introduce our first two constructive. On the framework, a Black man cannot detach his Blackness when a policeman pulls him over in America. Identity is always with us. The proposition has to answer why detaching identity is particularly good for movements, both the past and the future, when in other parts of life, identity cannot be taken away. Civil rights movements are founded on identity, so no matter what you argue, they'll either be focused on it or they won't happen at all. And I mean, think about this. How do you have a Black civil rights movement not centered on being Black? Ask yourself that. On to your first substantive. First, the proposition claims that identity politics fracture coalitions and stop collective movements because these groups separate based on identities that are important but not essential. First, are you saying that a Black man and a Black woman cannot or will not unite? For that, I have two lines of analysis. First is that identity politics have never stopped a movement. There has never been an identity that has purely excluded another one from gaining freedom except the hegemonic identity, the white people, the KKK, and the like. Minority identities have always been in coalitions, and only identity is what bonded them together. Secondly, you say that the civil rights movement was an example of identity politics, and that led to united coalitions. But in doing so, you actually just made an argument for the opposition by saying that coalitions did come about because of identity politics in the first place. Secondly, without people with strong identities to spark movements, they just don't happen. You need somebody that identifies strongly and politically with Black queerness, for example, to spark that movement. Secondly, you say that identity politics commodify history because you ignore the people who suffered for you. One answer. You don't have a history without identity. When you say that Republicans named Carson as an example of a post-racial America, we say that without identity politics, that's just how it's left. You don't actually have any groups or any identically politicized groups challenging that notion of a post-racial America. Their very presence is proof enough that post-racial America does not exist. And moreover, one Black man does not dismiss an entire movement. On to our first substantive argument. Identity politics allows people to connect with each other by using history and shared events as the basis for commonness to create coalitions. While the proposition would have you believe that identity politics fractures coalitions, in actuality, their points hold more in theory than in practice. We only have to argue that coalitions and unity are uniquely formed during civil rights movements. We don't have to say that they're always unified, because the opposition will tell you just as easily as the proposition that they aren't. Julia. But when presented with a common goal, when disrupted by a moment in history that fundamentally moves all these different groups to act, they unite. Hundreds of identities, which you claim are infinitely regressive, join together specifically for the movement and create coalitions. And if we can prove that that happens, then the opposition wins the round. For this, we have two primary examples. One sounds kind of random. It's like lead poisoning in the water of Flint, Michigan. When you have very different factions of all different religions, races, genders, and sexual orientations coming together and mutualistically acting, because it was a moment that affected all of them equally. What they cared about was not colored by black or pink or rainbow. It was colored by the discolored water that they were drinking. But on a more applicable topic, in the 1960s civil rights movement, during the movement, Black people, queer people, women, and other marginalized groups joined together to win major battles. And after the major battles were won, it's true, Black activists did create Black power. Women did set out to create their own agendas. They did splinter off. But that was after the movement in the first place. But before I move on, a point.
I hardly think you can equate something like the poisoning of water in an area to a civil rights movement. One is based around identity, one is based around pollution. How do you reconcile this disconnect?
I reconciled it with my second example about the 1960s civil rights movement. Moreover, the proposition tries to skew how infinitely regressive identity politics are. But I don't walk into a gay pride parade saying, I'm Julia, a white, Jewish, asthmatic, almost midget LGBT cat lover, brown-eyed, exercise-hating girl in a single-parent household with great eyebrows. In theory, I see what you're saying about it becoming infinitely regressive, but that's how far your point goes. Theory. For our second substantive, identity politics allow people to galvanize around what they have in common, more than gripe and argue about what they have as different. For that, we have one clear line of logic. Civil rights are passed through laws. Laws have to be voted upon, and as a result, you have people of all backgrounds and identities typically voting or galvanizing around what they have in common. We see this oftentimes with the Democratic Party. Since the dawn of the New Left, Black, Hispanic, and Asian voters are considered the most reliable Democratic voters, almost always voting Democrat despite the person running. What this shows is that the people who identify most with the liberal worldview are those who have experienced some lack of freedom or opportunity themselves. If we want to continue to compromise on their concerns, or dismiss them as special interests working against a nebulous, quote-unquote, greater good, will ultimately render our shared concept of liberalism totally meaningless. The proposition says that all voices conflicting each other just leaves us with silence. But on the opposition, we say that without these voices in the first place, all that we're left with is white noise. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for your speech. We now invite the second speaker for the proposition side to give their remarks.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, that we must learn to live together as brothers, or we will perish together as fools. It is because we stand behind this simple principle that we must unite in activism and not be divided as activists that we are proud to propose today's motion. What I'll be doing in today's speech is three things. Firstly, I'll find common ground that both sides can stand on in how we view this topic. Second, I'll compare the narratives coming to you from team government and team opposition. And third, I'll introduce the last substantive argument from team opposition, that we reinforce a harmful political structure. Let's talk about how each side views this motion. What we hear from the last opposition speaker is that identity is innate and can't be ignored. But Sonia gives you very sophisticated analysis about how this acknowledging of identity doesn't mean that we have to put it to the forefront like identity politics asks us.
Point of information.
There's no need to coalesce around identities, when instead what we should be doing, and what we have done successfully in the past, is coalescing around universally shared ideas and injustices. Take that, and now we apply it to the narrative given to you by both sides. Side opposition tells you in their first argument that in the past, the civil rights movement was formed around identity politics. We think that that's a misrepresentation. Then they say that in the present, for their second argument, groups with separate identities come together to support common causes, like the Democratic Party, like clean water in Flint, Michigan. And we tell you that that's false causal. And for the future, which is what this motion was supposed to be about, we don't hear anything, which is weird, because that's what it's supposed to be about. And so we'd like to hear a little bit more analysis from that later, but we think that they're trying to say this trend will continue. What we tell you on the proposition, on the other hand, is that in the past, the civil rights movement was based on uniting around ideas of injustice. When you have President Johnson saying that it's wrong that a black man can't vote, we think that's a universal idea not related to the identity of blackness, but related to the simple fact that it's a moral wrong. That's something that a black man, a white man, a man, woman, gay or straight person can all understand and see as an injustice. That is the universal idea, and that is why we take action. Moreover, we tell you that it's a misrepresentation to say that it's centered around identity politics. We look at the fact that there was probably a lack of female leadership during the civil rights movement at the time, but African American females didn't split off from it. Instead, they coalesced around a common injustice, a common idea that Asian Americans, white Americans could all stand up behind and say is wrong so that we could have greater progress. That's what we stand behind for the proposition bench today. Then we say that in the present, that's dampened because we try and embrace our individual identity at the cost of excluding others. We look to examples like on Southern college campuses where protesters create exclusive safe spaces that try and take out allies from the movement. We say, yes, that divides the movement. And we say that this is inherently bad in the future, where this motion is talking about, because we're in such a politically polarized society that you need a supermajority to get anything done. Think about it. We are at 70% approval rating for gay marriage in the United States, and it took the Supreme Court that long before they took action. Congress, which was supposed to represent us, did nothing, and it's only getting worse. We've got Bernie Sanders in the Democratic polls surging, and on the other side, we have Donald Trump sitting at the beginning. That's one, terrifying, and two, very indicative of a trend towards a more polarized America. We think that we need uniting towards a common goal that everyone can understand in order to get something done, not dividing into many different groups. Yes?
How does a generalized feminism movement account for all types of intersectional feminist problems?
It doesn't. What we tell you is we can move towards the things that are common first, because that's where all of our political pressure needs to be put. Because the problem is, neither Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders are acknowledging every single niche within feminism, so we need to show them the things that are common and understood to us. The second sort of narrative that we tell you is about why we unite. In our first argument, we say that we unite around issues that we think are important. So when we divide, we're saying that our issues are more important when we're struggling against structures that are problematic for us. And that divides the movement in our advocacy. Then, in our second argument, we say that sometimes people try to profit and get individual gain from working with those structures. So when Dr. Van Carson says that we live in a post-racial world. We say that it's inherently problematic because he's politicizing his blackness, using his identity politics in such a way that's harmful to the civil rights movement and African American community because it ignores their struggle, and he's doing it just for political gain within the Republican Party. Moving on now to our third substantive. We tell you that it's inherently harmful because what you end up doing is supporting harmful political structures. Like we just hear, that you have African Americans and minorities that identify and support with the Democratic Party, but then they say that the Democratic Party does things like support debates that are harmful for Bernie Sanders, despite the fact that he supports issues like stopping the school-to-prison pipeline that are inherently big towards the identity politics movement. We say that's the issue that you start to run into. Right here in Los Angeles, the converse of that was seen during the Civil Rights Movement, where they challenged President Johnson right after the signing of the Civil Rights Act to do more with riots. We think that is what an issue-oriented campaign looks like. We think that is what uniting not around identities, but around injustices and ideas look like. We think that is what the future of the Civil Rights Movement ought to look like. That is why we've never been more proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh, for your speech. I now invite the second speaker of the opposition side to deliver their remarks.
Side proposition comes up here and tells you that injustice creates action, but that identity politics divides activists. We agree that injustice does create action, but not by itself. You need injustice in addition to identity politics, the ability to look towards a common ground to push for true social reform in order to see true activists and true action. It is because on side opposition, we believe that politics dictate what you are, but identity politics dictate who you are, that we are proud to oppose this motion. In this speech, I'll be doing a few things. First, I'll be attacking all three substantive arguments that have been brought up by side proposition, and then defend and address the third substantive argument that side opposition has to provide. But before we get into all that, let's clarify some framework. Julia tells you very eloquently in her first speech that identity is inherently a part of us. You can't just detach your blackness just because you might feel like you want to. It's a part of who you are, it's a part of your identity, and therefore it's inherently political.
Sir.
Yes.
There's nothing about acknowledging identity that means you have to coalesce it around it like identity politics demands you do.
Identity politics demands that you coalesce around your identity. And because it's a part of who you are, it's the best way to coalesce around a problem. That's exactly the point that we are trying to make, and that's exactly why identity politics are the best way to push for civil rights movements and true social reform. But let's go into side proposition substantive arguments. Now, in their first speech, side proposition tells you that coalitions based on identity politics are inherently divisive. And they give you examples of black feminists and white feminists who weren't able to see eye to eye in second-wave feminism. However, that's not exactly true. We do support coalitions, and we do think that black feminists and white feminists do have their own problems. But that's exactly the point. They have their own problems, and they're separate from one another. Now, Josh gets up here and tells you that we should simply ignore one of those because they're intersectional, but that's inherently not true. We support these coalitions in the sense that they are able to push for their own reform. Black feminists push for their needs, white feminists push for their needs, and they support what they need in order to push for the reforms that they want. That is exactly what identity politics uniquely gives people in the coalition the ability to do. Something that simply blindly going into solving injustice as they would try to promote simply does not address. But we have more additional arguments to their first argument. First, we can tell you that you don't know about the injustice itself unless you have a system of identity and identity politics in the first place. But secondly, we would tell you that specific movements are actually good. Specific movements with regards to black feminists and white feminists are good in themselves because they promote their own ideals instead of promoting a blanket injustice that side proposition is touting. But third, we would tell you that coalitions already exist and work when based around identity politics. Julia already came up here and told you two examples very eloquently about how they united around dirty water, which they claim is just pollution, but it did show and demonstrate that people were of all colors, of all backgrounds, of all genders and races, were able to come together to promote a common goal. But she also told you about the civil rights movements in the early 1950s, in which you were actually able to promote social justice reform, something that just a blanket statement of injustice, again, did nothing to address. But let's go on to the side proposition's second substantive argument, which is that the history is inherently becoming politicized. And they give you this prime example of Ben Carson. But then again, it's just one example. And although they claim that the whole future of civil rights movements with regards to blacks is threatened, that is not true. Let me ask you a question. Even though Ben Carson is twisting his history and making it politicized, does Black Lives Matter still hold today? Yes, it does. Black movements can still exist. Just because one person is inherently politicizing his history does not mean it's all threatened. Disregard that example entirely. But let's go on to their third substantive argument, where they talk to you about how they're forced into going with the Democratic Party, as they say in their example. But this is not coercion, this is not force. It's people who identify with as blacks, as they would claim, go and actually make a conscious decision to try and promote those institutional reforms. And they see that the Democrats are the best way to do it. That's a conscious choice that they believe will push for the social reform that they want. But let's go on to the third and final substantive argument for side opposition, which is that even if identity politics is not perfect, without it, the only identity we would have would be the white heterosexual male with the exact same structural system that exists today. Now, this argument is very logical. Even if identity politics is not perfect, it is a check against hegemonic notions of identity that have been in power for far too long. What would the world be like if we had politics only centered around the white straight male with the structure being exactly the same? It wouldn't be centered around the female, it wouldn't be centered around the minority, nor the homosexual person. Because politics is always intertwined with identity, there needs to be identity politics that challenges normative conceptions of identity, and that challenges the structure itself. One of the most radical things an abnormal identity can do is to affirm their own identity. After one has been denied humanity because their identity is different from the normative one, affirming that identity is a prerequisite of being part of a movement for civil rights. We have clearly shown you throughout this entire debate that identity is an inherent part of who you are, and it's inescapable, which is why it is an inherent political nature that identity is a part of who you are and influences your political decisions. It's because we believe that politics dictate what you are, but identity politics dictate who you are, that we are proud to oppose the motion and hope you do the same.
Thank you, Nikhil, for your speech. We now invite the third speaker of the proposition side to give their remarks.
The future. That is what today's debate is about, and that is the narrative that has been consistently missing from Team Opposition's side of the House throughout today's debate. We cannot scream at each other while we talk about those who oppress us, but rather sit at a table and coalesce so we can fight back against those who oppress us. For all those reasons, we are proud to stand on the proposition side of today's debate. In this speech, I'm going to be doing a couple of things. First, I'm going to be responding to the entirety of Nikhil's final substantive arguments, and then after that, I'm going to be offering you two questions you should ask yourself when evaluating today's round. First, does identity politics unite us in the fight for the civil rights movement? And then secondly, is the civil rights movement intrinsically about identity politics? Before we move on, Nikhil's third argument. I'd like to clear up some clarification right now and make something explicitly clear. Identity politics is coalescing around identity versus coalescing around the injustice and the systemic oppression that individuals are facing. So, on team proposition, when we say we reject a focus on identity politics, we also reject the principle that the absence of identity means whiteness. We reject the principle that people will be coalescing around whiteness as well, because we also think that is bad. We would not advocate
for a world in which that is true. Again, we say that the idea of coalescing not around the individual identities, but around the injustice that people have. Moving on, we say that is the civil rights movement intrinsically about identity politics? There are a couple things we have to clear up regarding this question. But firstly, we ignored the analysis coming out of team opposition that Josh brings up to you about the super majority, the idea of infinite regression. On team proposition, we do not think that identity is intrinsically bad. However, we say at the point in which we regress infinitely upon ourselves, that creates like 50 different groups going in 50 different directions, and there can be no common unity around one common goal. This is where the key impact of the future comes into play. Right now, in today's society, more than ever, we are in a position where people are more uniquely predisposed to having different intersections in their identities. That is why it is more important to understand that we cannot focus on the parts that make us different, but rather things that bring us together. An example of this, during the civil rights movement, Mr. Bayard Rustin was MLK's person that always organized his events and was able to help him plan and be a key person in the civil rights movement. However, the fact that he was not only black, but openly queer posed a problem for him because he received no recognition at the time because he had to politic his blackness and his queerness to fit this institution at a time that did not accept his queer identity. We say this is bad. Again, we tell you how we have to ignore the idea of coalescing around the individual identity in favor of actually looking at these broader concepts of systemic injustice. Again, in the future, this idea that right now, more than ever, we are predisposed to having to look at these different intersections, we say that the civil rights movement, intrinsically, this will be a harm for it. But moving on, but before that, Julia.
Even if you deconstruct all identities, you will never solve structural racial inequality without questioning it through identity politics.
We say that in order to attack these systems that are actually hurting us, we have to not divide amongst ourselves and approach it from 50 different angles. That is exactly what the people who oppress you would want you to do. But moving on, the second question of does identity politics unite us or fight us against the future of the civil rights movement? We say this breaks down in two ways. First, divisions. Second, selective amnesia, something that has gone completely unresponded to on team opposition's side of the house. First, the idea of divisions. Some very important analysis that Josh brings up to you in his speech about the idea of the supermajority. How in our society, nothing gets done in terms of mass social change, and you have a supermajority backing that movement. At the point at which team oppositions want to split up movements that all have unique goals in order to help them fend for themselves, that is when it becomes detrimental for overall social change. We explained to you, this is the reason why within certain oppressed groups, there is privilege within oppressed groups which allow certain individuals to rise up over each other. This is why we see the normative focus of the queer rights movement focuses mostly on the identity of white heterosexual upper class men and ignores the identity of the 21 trans women of color that were murdered last year. We say that the point at which these identities are able to rise up against each other and separate each other out, that's a problem, and that is what creates these divisions. Secondly, the idea of selective amnesia. This is going to become very important when evaluating today's debate. A, because they have not responded to it, and B, it is the prime thesis of Team Proposition's case. Let's talk about what selective amnesia means. We say this is the idea of collective memory, that recognizing that there are people who came before you to suffer in order for your being able to actually have the opportunity to succeed today. We see that identity politics separates you from the very obligation you have to the collective memory of your people, because to create this individual myth of the self-made individual. We say that Ben Carson was able to wake up one day and forget how he was able to succeed to the position he is at right now and condemn the very tools that allowed him to get there as a campaign strategy. But at the point at which Ben Carson wants to stare at his own wounds, that is not going to solve the wounds of people who are still hurting in today's society. We see this again with the hashtag #WhyIDon'tNeedFeminism. We'd say the only reason these women are in the position to actually speak about why they don't need feminism is because women before them actually died for their right to say those things. We say that it is extremely detrimental, this idea of selective amnesia, that once you progress to a position of power, you can just forget the parts of your identity that are inconvenient for yourself. So at the end of the day, what do you have? On Team Proposition, we give you a very consistent narrative of the idea of coalescing around the systemic injustice of society. On Team Opposition, we do not hear nearly enough analysis coming out of the substantive material of selective amnesia and the idea of divisions, and clearly not enough focus on what this means for the actual future of the civil rights movement. Team Opposition is stuck in the politics of the past. Only Team Proposition recognizes the fight of the future. I reject Team Opposition, and I beg you all to do the same.
your speech, we now invite the third speaker of the opposition to deliver their remarks.
Side prop tells you we should come together around the idea of injustice, but we on the opposition say, one simple question: who is the injustice happening to? In our world, we understand that injustice happens to a specific identity, and that's why we need to come together around. Think of it like this. They want you to focus on the injustice of police brutality, but not focus on who that injustice is happening to. Their entire argument is let's coalesce around injustice without recognizing where does the injustice happen. And that's the framing for this debate. If we show you that coalescing around an identity is uniquely more better than coalescing around an injustice, that's why we win this debate. 2 questions in this speech. First, what is the nature of coalitions? And second, can identity politics change existing structures of hegemonic identities? Before we go into that, the framing. 2 quick things. 1, identity is inherently political. Not answered. You cannot detach any part of your identity in any other situations of life, so that doesn't mean you can attach it from political movements like the civil rights movement. We think identity is inherently political. They haven't answered that question. Second, it's not just about the injustice, it's about who the injustice happens to. So if we're showing that injustice happens to specific identities, we should probably formulate our politics around those identities. Yes.
We are not asking people to erase intrinsic parts of our identities. However, we say at the point in which we divide ourselves into so many groups that it renders the movement useless, we say that is when identity politics will actually threaten the future of the movement.
Really, that's funny, because in a POI, someone said, let's talk about different intersections of feminism, and Josh said, no, all feminism is the same. We think that ignores specific aspects of identity, because certain people in the feminist movement have different ideologies. Let's go to the first question. What is the nature of coalitions? So let's unpack this idea of feminism. They've told you in the second wave feminism movements in the 70s, white women literally alienated and demonized black women. We say, okay, so something needs to be done about that, right? The black feminist movement. Their argument is no, come together around the idea of the injustice of womenness, but don't recognize that black women have a very specific material condition that's different than white women. They say black feminism is bad. It's too specific to an identity. We say no, that identity is inherently political and it's different. Second of all, they say, oh, why can't we be all allies? Well, at a time when white women were demonizing black women, we don't think they're going to cooperate with them necessarily, especially when they co-opt the movement. Second of all, about the Democrats. Our argument is that people should coalesce around something that gives political change. If minorities come together and vote Democratic, we don't think that's coming together around the idea of institutional reform and injustice. We think because there's a political party that affects a specific identity or group of identities' needs, and that's why they vote Democratic. But you would disagree.
So at first we have white and black feminists separated into movements. Then what happens when within the black movement, a queer and a straight movement separates, and within that movement, geographic divisions appear. This is infinite regression. You buy into our
I'm
argument.
happy you brought that up. When white feminism demonized black women, it's because whiteness was a social and political construct in which they have the power to alienate black women. The black feminist movement doesn't have the political power to just alienate black queer women because they need those identities to be part of that movement. We think you're simplifying the power that white feminism had during the second wave feminism with the power that black feminists have today, or black women. Second question, can identity politics change in existing structures? Look, our fundamental argument is that without identity politics, the only identity we would have is the white, heterosexual male. Why? Because they've been in power for the longest time. They've been the most hegemonic identity globally. So without identity politics, without forming our political identity around the material conditions that we face, we think we can't check that out. We can't check that structural issue. Second of all, white heterosexual maleness is structural. It's not just an identity, it's an identity that imposes itself onto other people. Now this is important, because when one hegemonic identity imposes itself on other identities, it causes dehumanization. Because you are not the perfect identity, i.e. the white straight male, you are dehumanized. Our argument is that the most radical thing an identity can do is affirm that identity. is bring back that humanity that they've been lost because of the perfect identity that is said, you are not a human. That's why identity politics can protect resisting structures. Now we want to talk about the future, as Liz so eloquently said. The future of civil rights movements cannot happen if we don't understand our identity in the present day. Our argument is that an affirmation of your political identity is a prerequisite to any civil rights movement. They say it's too regressive. I didn't even know Julia had gray eyebrows till she said it today. We don't think every facet of your identity is always going to be part, but we do think some things are uniquely key. They say Bayard Russell was a black queer man and his identity wasn't able to be exposed. And then they say that's bad. This contradicts their entire first argument that says some parts of your identity are important but not essential. The first speaker said queerness was important, but blackness was essential. And then Liz gets up and says, oh, it's bad that Bayard Russell couldn't expose his queerness. On side opposition, that's what we say. We say that it's important to embrace all parts of your identity, not just your blackness, because there are different things that are important. They say 21 trans women of color were not recognized. More will not be noticed if we don't care about their identity. If we only say there's an injustice to trans women of color, but don't say, hey, it's the trans women of color, that identity that we need to focus on. Fundamentally, at the end of the debate, politics dictates what you are. But identity politics dictates how you dictate yourself towards that political realm, and that's why we oppose the motion that you to say.
Thank you, Emmett, for your words. We now invite the fourth speaker of the opposition side to deliver their speech.
In response to the specific type of oppression that black trans women feel, the proposition wants to push their identities to the back of the bus. Despite their white noise, you must recognize that identity politics is the only way out of oppression for many whose issues would never be heard otherwise. We get that side proposition doesn't want to erase people's personal identities. But what we also get is that they would just rather those people not talk about those identities in the public sphere, and that's why we oppose them. A clarification first. This is not a debate about whether identity politics should be the center of all movements. It's about whether or not it does more good than harm. And our position is that if you want to unite around a common goal, like justice, for specific populations of people that are affected, identity politics is the only way in which you can do that effectively. Two questions in this debate that show you why we win. First of all, can you have social movements without identity politics? Second, can those movements be effective without identity politics? If we show you that identity politics is key to either of these things, we should win this debate. The reason being that we've shown you identity politics is the only way to proceed with social movements. It's good for the civil rights movement. So first, can you have social movements without identity politics? To answer this question, we have to ask what exists in the absence of identity politics. And what exists is a White House built by slaves. What exists is structural violence that is completely and utterly independent of identity, that is just perpetuated by societal institutions, including money. And their privileged dream of quote-unquote uniting around common ground can't exist unless you break that up. So the most important question that we have to ask as a generation is, in the absence of interrogation of the American identity, who defines common ground? Who defines what justice is? In the world of a prison industrial complex, in the world of Michael Brown, in the world of Trayvon Martin, in the world where trans people of color are killed at dozens of the rate of white people, we know that the winds that blew the slave boats still blow the American flag. That the structure of America is still defined by the majority, and the only way that you can question the majority is through identity politics. How do you know this? Because the very words that they use to talk about identity politics only emerged since the 1970s when identity politics became a thing. They're talking about queerness, they're talking about transness from a position of white Americanism, and from my position, from a Greek boy's perspective. We know these words because of identity politics. That makes us as agents able to also advance those movements along with our brothers and sisters. The second clash, can movements be effective without identity politics? They say that identity politics fractures coalitions. A few unresponded to things that we say. First of all, how do you even know what those issues are without identity politics? We've already exposed to you that they only know the issues that they're talking about because of identity politics. And future issues will only be known because people come together and show you that their niche issues matter. We've also told you that specific movements are good. Latino trans people, for example, experience a different type of oppression than, just like a black male. And so they need a different type of movement. Their answer to this is, we know that. We just would rather just focus on general inequality. We say that you're going to ignore literally hundreds of thousands of people's struggle. Josh, I don't know why you said that, but it's a reason why your side should lose. Third, they talk about civil rights. Okay, civil rights happened in a time where identity politics existed. Civil rights itself was an awakening of the black identity in America. That's a reason why coalitions can come together and fight for what's right, even if identity politics exists. In fact, there's a counterexample to their side, showing that identity politics does not fractionalize people. We've also shown you, for a more modern example, the example of Flint, Michigan. The second thing that they say is that, it destroys your identity, that people like Ben Carson create a colorblind society because, Republicans think that the world is colorblind. Wait a minute. Since slavery, people have been arguing that society is colorblind, that black people are equal to white people. This is not a unique thing to Ben Carson. But what is unique is the only way you can question that is through identity politics. So the net benefit that we have over here is that we create questioning of the system, interrogation of it. We also tell you that we cause change through discourse, that you know these trans people's struggles, that it creates more movements, that you don't have to be black or woman, that you can be black and woman and support both of those struggles independently and together. We also tell you that the only way to gain political power, to create voting blocks in which you can actually change your social situation, is through identity politics. And in the end, for the millions of people who have identities that are not necessarily recognized by the whitewashed majority, we say do not listen to their white noise and accept identity politics for the future of social justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for your speech. We now invite the last speaker of the proposition side to deliver their remarks.
A cacophony of voices shouting over each other achieves nothing. This is the distinction that side opposition misses. Because at the end of the day, you can talk about fighting for every single individual, but at the cost of doing that, you sacrifice the very people that you're trying to help. Address the big issues, that's what we say on the proposition team. 2 questions in the speech. Firstly, what's the connection between identity politics and coalitions? And secondly, what's the relationship between identity politics and politics? But first, 3 strategic errors by the opposition bench. Firstly, they've been having this debate in the wrong world. All of their examples and all of their analysis come from the past. Nick in his last speech even tells you that the words that we use, trans, feminist, all come from identity politics movements. Sure, in the past, we gave you specific analysis in Liz's speech that says that the world today and in the future is uniquely and comparatively more regressive. So because they never engaged with that analysis, they're not actually talking about today's motion. Secondly, they conflate 2 very different ideas, identity and identity politics. This is how they frame the route. We agree, you can't separate identity from an individual, but coalescing around that identity and using it in a way that's infinitely regressive is what identity politics is. This is why we say you should unite around unifying things, like injustice, like equality, things that happen to various identities, but things that can also unify them. Never responded to on the opposition bench. Third and final mistake, we don't advocate for the absence of identity politics on the proposition. What we say is, firstly, when you deconstruct identity, you also deconstruct the structures from which whiteness stems. But secondly, we say that we support fighting injustice and not coalescing around individual identities. It's not the absence of identity politics, it's around injustice. First question in this speech, what's the relationship between identity politics and coalitions? This has been the thesis of side proposition's case. We've told you throughout the bench that identity politics uniquely divides people because of too many contradictions within groups. We gave you the analysis of a black policeman and a black protester who simply can't agree because of their aspects of a cop and a protester. All that they say is, well, Black Lives Movement still happen. Sure, but these things are damaging to those movements. We say that they debilitate these movements, and that's why it would be better without them. But uniquely, what they miss on the opposition bench is that in today's world, we need unity more than ever. Josh gives you very specific analysis on why supermajorities in our polarized world today are necessary. But when you infinitely regress into smaller and smaller groups, even with good intentions, you end up harming the people that you're trying to help. We gave you examples of this. Pointed to second wave feminism. All that admin tells you to this is, well, at least they tried. It's a consequence of white women demonizing black women, not identity politics. We say no, a straight black woman would still be equally likely to demonize a queer black woman. This is infinitely regressive. You always devolve into smaller groups, and in today's world, that's not a luxury that we have. But next we talked to you about queer rights. We said even within movements that function, you're only getting a single picture of the movement. Queer movements only point to straight white males who are gay. We are gay males. The difference is they never look at the 21 queer females who are transgender who were killed in cold blood on the streets. We think that's a consequence of identity politics that they never touch on. But then, let's look to the examples that we get from the opposition bench. They're all from the past. They point to the civil rights movement, and they say it's a case of identity politics. But then, let's engage them on that ground. Even within the civil rights movement, Bayard Rustin wasn't able to talk about his individual identity politics because that would have fractured the movement. So even within their own example, people are defaulting to injustice rather than coalescing around individual identity. Even on their ground, this motion doesn't function. But secondly, we would ask the question, what's the relationship between identity politics and real politics? This is where side opposition falls flat. Because we tell you that in the political world today, people commodify their identities in order to get a leg up. We give you an example of Ben Carson. All that Nick tells you in his speech is Ben Carson is one example. We say, no, you extrapolate from Ben Carson and look at the entirety of our political system, because people try to whitewash their culture to get a leg up. That's a consequence of identity politics. But then we tell you the societal ramifications go further. We point to Republican parties and white people who can conveniently say, oh, we have a black man running for president, so we've done our job, we live in a post-racial society. We think that's a consequence of identity politics that's particularly damaging. But then we say, the only thing side opposition gives us on this is that they galvanize action because of identity politics. Sure, but they're galvanizing 10 different actions in 10 different directions. We need realistic change, not an ideal world. You can never let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If you stand for change, if you stand for unity, and if you stand for real discourse in the world today, then you stand with the proposition.
It was a close decision. In the end, it was a 3-2 decision for the proposition. At this point, we're going to let the judges give their comments to the debaters, and we'll start with one of the judges who voted for the opposition, and then we'll just kind of go down the line. And they'll each give their reason for decision, as well as tips to any individual debaters that they wanted to give comments to as well. So,
well, hello, I would be one of those votes for the opposition. Though, let me say first, I have been practicing law for nearly 25 years, and I was so impressed with all 8 of you. Come down and work for the city attorney. No, but really so proud of all of you, and I thank you for the work you put into this, and very impressed with the way you acquitted yourselves here today. Really, the substance, we talked, in fact, very timely subject matter. Thought both sides covered it well. I would say that the eye contact, those of you who may at least looked over towards the judges, impressed me, and so in terms of style, that was important to me. I don't know if that's something that is even expected or certainly permitted to be done, I'm sure. That made an impact on me, and the recovery from the interruptions. I'm sure for those of us who I'm not that familiar with debate. And we would warn ahead of time that that was something that was permitted. But really liked the way all of you recovered, or didn't. You know, when you quieted the interruptions. But I think that is very important. All of you very articulate. I liked the body language. You know, is it amen? No. Oh, there was an energy even in your physicality that impressed me and commanded my attention. And those are just my general thoughts. I will pass it off.
I have not been practicing law quite as long as Dan. Been in class since law school, but not quite as long. But I want to say that you guys were tremendous, really, really impressive. I couldn't see one of you. Is that Josh? Yep. Great job, thank you. You guys were all terrific. One thing I thought was, I thought that the proposition did a very good job on a very tough side of an argument, and in terms of coming up with first of all, kind of maybe strategy is the right term, but the theme of the future, which I thought that each of you hammered home very well and very effectively, and it was a tough, it was a tough thing to counter. I thought that the opposition had tremendous energy in each one of you, and all of you are terrific speakers. In my job, I have to speak a lot. I wish I had some of your techniques, but some of you, were very, very polished. A couple of you even, stepped back from the lectern, which I thought was particularly impressive. And I agree with Ann. Eye contact goes a long way, but you had us engaged. And what I thought was a very difficult topic. I mean, maybe all the main topics are this difficult, but this one was timely, but very difficult. I thought you guys did a really, really terrific job. Stylistically, I would just say one constructive comment. Some of you have a little bit of the flying hands thing. I would try and keep that a little bit under control. But I think all of you spoke exceptionally well. I know you're trying to get away in a short period of time. I thought you were terrific with that. But I thought that the substance of some of the arguments on the proposition side, kind of given the difficulty of some of the aspects of that side, carried the day for me.
So I've been a lawyer for longer than both of these folks, about 35 years myself, and again, I'm not anyone who ever participated in debate in school, and I guess I sort of regret having not done so because of the excellent job that really all of you did. I was one of those who was on the proposition side, and I think, in terms of looking at the various categories that we were asked to think about, I think both sides were equally matched when it came to style and strategy. I think where the balance tip for me was on content, and there the comments that were made, the attempt to analogize the civil rights movement to what's happened, to the horrific things that are happening in Flint, Michigan at the moment, didn't work for me, and that was one thing that sort of stuck in my craw, along with the comment, I think, too, about the proposition itself being focused on the future. I thought, that there was obviously a deliberate attempt made on the side of the proposition to hammer you guys for not focusing on the future, but on the other hand, the future is the future. We haven't met it yet. We don't know what politics will look like in the future because we haven't been there. And so, inherently, the question that was posed and that you were asked to deal with was a very difficult and almost intractable problem. One last comment. I think it was Liz who initially mentioned Bayard Rustin, and I wasn't clear whether the claim was that he was openly gay at the time that he was involved in the civil rights movement. I think the fact is that he was not. Subsequently, he was. But I don't know how that actually plays out in the context of this. But again, I share my colleagues' comments that really all of you did a truly exceptional job, and I was honored to have been asked to be a judge here today.
Since we're all sharing how long we've practiced. I got a decade as a civil rights lawyer and a decade as a constitutional law professor, so I'm a stickler, to be honest. It's been a pleasure to be here, and I actually voted in favor of the opposition. It was very close. I did do the tallying of the numbers, and as I look at it, substance-wise, I had you fairly equal. The third speaker on the opposition side actually tipped the balance, on both substance, and it's only by a hair, but also style by a hair, and strategy by a hair. So overall, we weren't very far apart as judges. As far as the topic, I think you were given a very difficult topic, because when you start with a phrase like identity politics, you're already starting with a very loaded term, and a loaded term that really puts the onus on the proposition to really have to overcome the idea of there are people who are just opposed to identity politics because they're opposed to what it can accomplish. So there's a lot of extra baggage with the topic that you had before you. But as far as things that I thought you both did well, I think both sides did well in tackling that topic. But as far as suggestions on specifics, I did find moments where I felt both sides had some taglines that were maybe just a little too pithy, given how touchy the topic is, and the effort to say that identity politics versus politics is about what you are and who you are. That I just don't think that got you over the threshold that you wanted to. But I think I saw that on both sides, and I think again you were given a difficult topic because you were choosing to talk about identity, other people's identity, and without Black team members talking about Blackness and so many Black leaders. I see you nodded, or like you were conscious that this was a difficult thing to do. And so why the third speaker was particularly persuasive to me is because he brought in his own identity, and something as someone who has had expertise in this. I think the third and the fourth. I think both of you did. And I say that as being important because to have authenticity on this subject, it's important for you to recognize that, and you did in some ways, but I just wanted to say that it took courage to do that, and I think that can be rewarded both. You got points from me on both style and strategy for doing that, because that ultimately made you persuasive. But I agreed with a number of the critiques of the use of the Flint, Michigan aspect. And I guess my last point would be that when you do have a topic like this, like any topic, like if the topic were a science topic, you do run the possibility of encountering people who are expert on the substance. So I think there were some areas where you were just a bit off on the facts, and Maynard Rustin was one of the ones that stood out. But when you use terms, like I want to credit you for using terms like hegemony, you use that very well and accurately. Terms like intersectionality, though, I think you threw it out there, but it's one that if you had done maybe a little bit more research on the concept of intersectionality, it could have brought, I think, you over the line substance-wise. I think either side could have used intersectionality as a concept that could have taken you substantively over to get more points than I actually gave you. So I thought it was very close, and I commend you all for taking on a very tough challenge and doing so well.
Hey guys. First of all, this is a good-looking debate team. This is not what I thought the debate team looked like. But I agree with everyone. I thought you guys were both really, strong. I went for the prop side. I think it was a really hard argument because they were so closely related in so many ways. And my personal politics might lean more toward the opposition, and that's why I felt the fact that I'm leaning more to the proposition help, and it really did boil down to the fact that the conceit of the question was about the future. And I feel like that was where they really hammered home, the idea of what future politics would look like in terms of, the idea being how does it affect us moving forward. And I really felt like the things that you guys were saying swayed me a little bit. I really felt like the opposition used humor. Saying as a television writer, I really feel like humor actually is a good way to sort of bring people into your conversation. I thought that the proposition could have actually been, you guys were really passionate. I really like that, but I thought you could have actually used a little bit of humor. And even, some self-deprecating remarks that they always sort of, whenever you can do that, you make someone a little bit more willing to hear you because you humanize yourself a little bit more. And then also, I really appreciated the idea from the proposition how you gave me, substantive things that really resonated, like Ben Carson, why they be feminist. They were moments that I felt like I could latch onto. And I, found like, at least in writing, that, the universality is in the specific, is in the specificity. It's not really trying to put everything, it's actually finding something really specific. And then in that way, it will speak to way more people than trying to pander to everyone. When you gave me those specific notions, it actually drew me in more. So, you guys were really so impressive, and it gives me some hope for, hopefully my kids will be better than I think they're going to be.
Okay, we're done. Thank you, judges, for thank you to Portia Collins for helping bring these judges together. Thank you to those who videotaped this. This will actually be available. The entire debate and comments will be available online. Those of you that RSVP'd, I will send you the link. If you did not RSVP, go to the Harvard-Westlake website. We'll make sure that there is a link up there for you to be able to download it and watch it. So stick around. Judges, feel free to give comments to kids another one lecture. And thank you so much for coming. This was our first public debate. I think it's great. Thank you.